Well, I'd now like to start the webinar and thank everybody for joining us today, where we're going to be talking about governance models, ecosystems, and the benefits of APIs in public sector organisations. I'm Robin Smith from the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, and I'm looking after some of this work with colleagues that are joining us here from Deloitte and Key Leuven as part of the ELISE Squared programme. Next slide, please. So this is part of our action under the ELISE Squared programme, ELISE, European Location Interoperability Solutions for E-Government. It's the only action dealing with some geospatial issues in the ELISE Squared programme. And under that work, to help people understand more about what we're doing and to explore new topics, we have the ELISE Knowledge Transfer Project with Deloitte and Key Leuven, where we're looking into location interoperability issues for the digital transformation of government. And within that work, we're using a rapid studies approach to quickly dive into some important topics we want to explore, to share with you, participants in this meeting, and others about what we've come to understand. And of course, in this case, we're dealing with APIs. The webinar is an opportunity to not only share with you what we've been doing, but for you to also give us some feedback and also potentially direction on where we're going with this work. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Raphael from the Deloitte team, who's been looking in particular into the API work, and I'll come and join you at the end of the meeting. So please, Raphael, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Robin. So I will walk you through this presentation about application programming interfaces. This is a really broad topic, but as the goal is to get a better understanding of the role of such technology can play in the context of digital transformation and geospatial data sharing, we have selected a number of topics to cover, some of which I may glance over rather quickly, but in all cases, there will be references and material available at the end of the presentation. So this presentation is structured as follows. We will start with some API basics, where we will define the main terms and kind of describe the ecosystem and the different players in this ecosystem. And then we'll provide a quick overview of the policy context related to APIs. And then the rest of the presentation will be structured based on a number of those selected topics that are relevant both from a perspective of an organization acting as a data or an API provider, and some topics that are more relevant when the organization is acting as a data or API consumer. So some of the topics that we will cover in this API basics section is what are APIs? What are the different types of APIs? How do they work? And as I mentioned before, what the API ecosystem and policy contexts are. So first, let's start with the definition. APIs are a software intermediary that allows two applications to exchange information in a standardized format. This is represented in the figure at the bottom of the slide, where you have API functionalities that are indeed specified in a standardized format and allow the client application to make a request to the server application and obtain a response following those functionalities that are defined. So there are different types of APIs that are based on how they are utilized. We have those two main categories, which are the internal APIs, which are APIs that are used internally within an organization, and external APIs, which are used by organizations to interact with external parties. So the main benefits of internal APIs is that they reduce the development costs, and instead of dealing with siloed application within the organization, different parts of the IT systems can be available to different parts of the organization. External APIs can be defined, you can make the distinction between what we call restricted APIs or unrestricted APIs. And restricted APIs, also sometimes called partner APIs, are used to facilitate the communication and integration of software between the organization itself and its specific partners. So these are kind of a hybrid between fully open APIs and private APIs. And a key design consideration in this case is the authentication and access management, as you don't want the resources that are exposed by the API to be available to everyone. Unrestricted APIs, which are also sometimes called public APIs or open APIs, are designed in a way that an organization can expose some of its assets to a wider population, basically anyone who is willing to use it. And for that, the main benefit is to allow an organization to stimulate the development of new applications and services, and therefore adding value to their core business and interacting with a larger audience. But because of that, there are a few considerations in the design of those APIs. It's the interface that needs to be accessible. And then management and security are also a key consideration, since you're really opening up some systems from your organization to everyone, basically. An example of this is Google Maps, which is very, very widely used. Now for the rest of the presentation, we will be looking at the API ecosystem from a provider-consumer perspective. So what we call API consumers, well, basically they're users of data or services that are provided by the API to fulfill a defined need. So it could be querying a database or providing a services on their website, but using services that were designed by other people, or using data processing and modeling algorithms to make sense of their own data. API providers, on the other hand, they want to make some of their own content, be it data, algorithms, or other digital resources, available on the internet in a machine-readable format so that other services or applications can use this content. So the figure in this slide is mainly based on a publication of Debiche et al., which describes the API ecosystem as a multi-layered value chain, where you have the different layers represented here, where you have the business assets, which is the organization asset that is exposed, the application programming interface itself, which is used to deliver services based on those assets, the software application layer, which is basically the interface that is used towards the end users. We would also like to provide an alternative view of this value chain, where we want to represent the domain layer more as a transversal layer, as the, I would say, the business question, the reason why you're developing an API, should be a consideration throughout the whole life cycle of the of your data, where you want to know, for example, what you're trying to bring to an end user and why. Now, what do these roles mean for governments and public administrations? So digital governments and public sector organizations can act as both providers and consumers, where they enable some services for other public administrations, for individuals and citizens, and for businesses. So on the left-hand side, we have a diagram representing how governments or public administrations can act as a provider, providing some services to businesses or citizens. And in turn, the bottom layer of this figure shows that businesses in turn can use these APIs that are provided by public sector to provide services to other businesses or to provide services to citizens. On the right-hand side, the same view, but just to illustrate that governments and public administrations can also be consumers of APIs that are developed mainly by businesses, but also sometimes in the context of citizens. The arrow that makes the link between the government and the citizens are dashed, and this is because it is very rare that the interaction between the government and citizen occurs directly through APIs like that, and usually there's an intermediary, often a business, but it could happen, and so we haven't excluded that fully from our picture. Now, as providers, public authorities can increase the value of their information, as I previously mentioned, by developing new services, by exposing the information from their organization to be used by others, to gain also operational flexibility, to kind of break the dependency to legacy systems, to interact better with each other and with businesses and citizens, to innovate, and also to increase transparency of their service and comply with all sorts of regulation, including the General Data Protection Regulation, which we will talk about into more details later. The right-hand side of the slide, I just provided a few examples, but of course it's non-exhaustive, but of cases where a public administration provides APIs in a successful way. So you have Transport for London. They provide all their data through APIs, and as a result of that, there are now over 600 applications that are powered by this data, and these applications are used by 42% of the citizens of London. So this is a really good example of how a public administration can gain some value from and offer better services by using APIs. Another example is the API catalog has been provided by the platform api.gouv.fr, where all of the public sector APIs available in France are centralized on one platform, and they're reused by a lot of actors in the private and public sector. As a API consumer, public authorities can integrate new data sources into their systems and processes, develop better services by exploiting this new information, and join innovative ecosystems that foster collaboration with different actors. Some examples of this are participatory democracy and citizen science, which will be the topic of the next rapid study that is part of this project, and also business to government collaboration, which is very relevant, for example, in the context of healthcare, telecom, and energy, where data held by companies can be very relevant for decision-making and the provision of public services, and by making use of APIs that are provided by those companies, the public authorities can improve their services, for example. Now, why do APIs matter for geospatial data? What is the link? Amongst all the different types of data that can be made available through APIs, geospatial data are very important for three main reasons. First of all, because of their characteristics as a type of data. So geospatial data can be integrated with any other data source and can complement these data because everything happens somewhere. An example of this is how Eurostat provides all the geographical information and mapping services via the GISCO data distribution API, which allows end users, be it from public services or policy units, as well as any external developer that want to use this data for mapping their own data, for example, and for creating applications based on that. Another characteristic of the geospatial data is that they're relevant for decision makers, especially when it comes to real-time data. And this is one example of this is how geospatial data is used to power some web services, such as for the mitigation of natural hazards. And then finally, geospatial data and mapping APIs are very important for all sorts of online services. For example, parking applications in cities, checking availability of retail items, etc. Okay, so in the rest of the presentation, as I mentioned earlier, we will consider a number of different topics that are key considerations from an organizational point of view, a legal point of view, a technical point of view, and even a semantic point of view, based on whether or not you're an API provider or consumer. They might be more or less relevant, but they will be, we will talk about this in the rest of the presentation. Some of them we will be able to go over in a little bit more detail, and some will just be introduced as kind of food for thought. So before we address these different questions, I just want to mention a little bit the policy context within the European Union. I don't want to go into details about it during this webinar, but I just want to point to a number of regulations and directives that are relevant to the topic of APIs, given their role in the data sharing economy. So first of all, there's the General Data Protection Regulation. This one we will discuss a lot more, but there's also the Free Flow of Non-Personal Data Regulation, the Public Sector Information Directive, the Payment Service Directive, and the Data Sharing Support Center. Finally, I would also like to mention the role APIs can play for public services in working towards their commitment to the Talent Declaration and ensuring the delivery of high quality, efficient, and secure user-centric digital public services for citizens, as well as the cross-border collaboration for public services with businesses. So the ways in which APIs can help with this is for the principle of digital by default, which stipulates that European citizen and business may interact digitally with public administration, and that the quality of those services has to be in a certain, at a certain level. And then finally, with the trustworthiness and security, information security and privacy need to be taken into consideration when designing public services, which APIs can help with, and we will talk about that more later. Okay, so from an API provider perspective, we will look at the roles and responsibilities for implementing an API, a few legal considerations such as licensing, data sharing, big data, and artificial intelligence. And then finally, a few technical considerations when it comes to actually implementing the sharing of personal data, implementing algorithms for big data and analytics, the Internet of Things, API management through API gateways, loosely coupled services, and standards for designing APIs. So first of all, one of the key organizational considerations as an API provider is in establishing the right roles and responsibilities that are required to manage your API through its entire life cycle, from its design to its implementation, and finally through following up and managing the service to make sure that it can continue addressing the rationale behind its implementation. So the view on this slide on the left-hand figure is taken from more an industry point of view, but while some of those terms may not be directly applicable to the public sector, such as the Executive Steering Committee, the ideas behind this diagram are definitely relevant to the public sector as well. One of the key roles is the API Product Manager, which acts as an intermediary between all the technical team and the top layer on the figure, which is, the steering committee, but also the business domain owners and the service owners, which are very relevant in the context of public sector bodies because they know what service they want to provide to the citizen. They know the different needs of the different stakeholders. And so they have to communicate with the product manager, which will pass on this information to make sure that this is taken into account when you develop and implement the API. From an organizational point of view, there is also key considerations for APIs and how public sector bodies can deal with emerging trends in the data sharing and digital transformation context. So with the fast-paced development of big data and artificial intelligence, there is an increased amount of data that is available to process and use. And this abundance of data and different ways of process means that you need to use different tools and techniques to extract meaningful value out of these data. And API are a way to provide such data streaming and processing techniques to a wider audience. We'll see more about that later. But as ways to make use of this data, there are machine learning and AI algorithms, which of course come with the ethical considerations behind the use of artificial intelligence. Again, we'll go into more details about that later, but there are the two main issues that I'd like to highlight here are the fairness of the algorithms and the transparency of the algorithms. Next, we'll look at a bunch of legal considerations as an API provider, and obviously the question of licensing is very important for any organization that wants to develop and provide an API. So licensing considerations require viewing the API as a stack of different layers, each of these layers having a specific licensing consideration. Of course, the different types of APIs, which we've mentioned earlier, whether they're private, restricted, or unrestricted, will result in different approaches to the licensing. In the case of private APIs or restricted APIs, the licensing will be more traditional, should I say, where it will depend on contractual agreements between the different parties that use the API. But when it comes to unrestricted APIs, there are a number of resources that are available to look into more details of the different levels of the API and how you have to deal with the licensing of this. So, for example, you have the server code. In most cases, the APIs, in most cases, the API provider will keep the server code proprietary. But in the cases that this code will be open, then there are a number of open source software licenses that can be considered, and we'll look into some of those examples in the next slide. In the case of data, which is the most common reason for publishing an API, Open Data Commons can provide some licensing options. You also want to consider licensing considerations for the content. Again, I'll show some of the resources available on the next slide. And then finally, you have the API interface itself, which is kind of subject to the same kind of licensing as other software and Creative Commons licenses. And then the client code, it should be considered separately from the server code, and it is also subject to some licensing considerations. So the main objective of licensing the content of your API is to define to which extent an API can be used, and to also limit the liability of API providers in case of failure of the API, which is definitely something you need to consider. This slide just shows a number of resources that are available. So you have GitHub's Choose a License, which will help you walk through different open source licenses, as illustrated here. There are all sorts of data licenses for open data, which could potentially be reusable for open APIs. And then finally, for licensing digital content, there are some Creative Commons. If you go on their website, it will also walk you through the choice of the right license. So as mentioned earlier, a key legal consideration as an API provider also is related to the sharing of personal data. For this question, we will focus on the GDPR, and in particular, some of the GDPR rights of data subjects that are most relevant for API providers are the right to erasure, so the right of a data subject to be deleted from the system, The right to restriction of processing, which means that the data can be kept but needs to be marketed as restricted and cannot be used for further processing without the user consent. The right to data portability, which means that the user has the ability, the provider needs to be able to export the data in a machine-readable format at any time upon the request of the data subject. The right to rectification, which means that a user can request at any moment that the provider modifies their personal data. The right to be informed, so similarly to the right to data portability, the user can be provided information about their personal data and its usage in a human readable format. And then the right to access, which allows the user to request at any moment to see how much data you have about them and to see what data you have about them. Some other basic principles that are included in GDPR that are relevant in this context is the principle of data minimization, so the fact that data should not be collected more than necessary, and the integrity and confidentiality, which means that security measures need to be put in place to protect data and to guarantee that the data has not been modified. So here I just want to mention the example of Solid, which is a project that aims to address true data ownership and improve privacy. More information can be found at the end of the presentation regarding this specific topic. So there are pros and cons to APIs in the context of the GDPR. So first of all, APIs make it easier to comply with some of these major considerations that we just went over. So as the GDPR aims at ensuring that organization protects users' personal data, API gateways are a very good way to protect the data and also to allow users to have access to all this information about them in a rather easy way. And then, of course, as the GDPR states that if personal information about a user has been shared with other parties, you need to be able to provide a list of those parties. And that is also something that API gateways can do. So we'll talk about that in more details later. However, there is a tricky point related to the use of APIs in the context of the GDPR, is that there is no guidance on the matter of portability. So nothing is mentioned about how APIs need to be structured, whether they should be open or closed, and nothing is specified either in terms of standardization and terms of license. Finally, when it comes to the sharing of non-personal data, there's the Open Data and the Public Sector Information Directive that are particularly important. Basically, they impose the use of API to all public sector bodies that fall in scope of the legislation, meaning that they have to provide access to high-value data sets, which must be available free of charge. And the PSI stipulates that APIs are the preferred solution for the provision of this data. Voilà. And so in the context of sharing of personal data, I just wanted to draw your attention to the European Data Exchange Initiative, for which I provide the reference at the bottom of the box. But is built on the principle that individual organizations and communities producing their data should retain full control over this data. So it's a really nice initiative. So now, what are the technical considerations that are related to the protection of personal data? So in order to ensure GDPR compliance as an API provider, there are certain technical features that are key to be implemented, and these include the identity protection, and this can be achieved through pseudonymization and anonymization. And then another very important consideration is the right to erasure, and so you have to be able to delete any information about someone in your system if it is requested. So in this context, as an API provider, it is important that you have that you expose a forget-me endpoint, which will allow a user, for example, to request that erasure, and that can be easily implemented, and that you are sure that everything about that client or that person is indeed deleted from your system. Okay, so there are two main impacts of big data and big data analytics that the API economy has resulted in. It's the generation of huge volumes of data. So now, indeed, APIs are not restricted to developers. They can be used by anyone. And as a result of that, there is a lot of data that is generated by these APIs, which is described in this bullet point here that I've just circled with the box. Basically, why this is very relevant for public service delivery is that any data that is generated about the use of the API that you're providing can be accessed and analyzed at any point, and this can provide information about the usage of your service, which in turn will allow the API provider to ensure that the service is meeting its audience's requirements and needs. It will also ensure that the services are delivered in an efficient way, and it will allow the organization to reduce its costs, for example, by identifying services that are not used and being able to focus the effort away from those. When it comes to the analysis of large data sets, we will cover those topics in some more detail later, but we will look, for example, at cognitive APIs, which have the capacity to process very complex and unstructured data, which is also often the case when you look at government and public services, that you have to process more unstructured data than structured data. And then it also allows for more efficient computing, which is also relevant when you have a vast amount of data or a lot of unstructured data. So, as I already mentioned, in the context of big data, APIs can be used for collecting data, for storing the data, and for making sense of the data. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about this slide because we're going to cover a lot of those topics in the next slide, where we look at how data can be collected through sensors, for example, with the Internet of Things, how this data can be stored, and mostly how you can make sense of the data to provide services to decision makers, to businesses, scientists, or whatever. So as an example of these applications of APIs in the context of big data, I wanted to talk about the Internet of Things and the role of APIs in the Internet of Things. So on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a little diagram that basically shows how APIs are used in this context, where you have the user that is either collecting data via a sensor and then sending that to its mobile device and a backend, all that via APIs, or a user that is using its mobile device to query data that is collected by a sensor via their mobile device. Most of the capabilities of IoT and IoT platforms are achieved using APIs. That's the connection between the service, the device, and the internet, securing this connection, managing and controlling the provisioning of those services, analyzing the data in a timely, often real-time manner, and then, of course, building and sharing these applications through to the users is also achieved via APIs. So an example of this as to why APIs are relevant to the Internet of Things is because APIs are key to supporting interoperability because they're based on standards. And so this is, for example, relevant to smart cities, where connected devices are used to collect data and to generate the insights in near real time. And so there are a number of references to papers that really highlight the role that APIs can play in this context. Okay, so now I just want to briefly talk about API gateways because for API providers, the management of your API is a key technical consideration. So once you have put your API into production, you have to keep an eye on it and monitor whether it is behaving in the way that you have designed it to be or whether there is an issue with it. So this can be done via API gateways indeed, which are, for that I've provided a little diagram at the bottom of the slide, which show that an API gateway can receive the request, check whether or not the response to the client request is available or not, route the request to the right services, and all that can be done by while ensuring the authentication of the user, and of course logging all that information for the transaction in the backend, which is very useful, again, in the context, for example, of GDPR, so that you can audit every request and how the response has been handled. Another technical consideration as an API provider is the concept of loose coupling. This is very important when you're providing microservices, and for this, I'd like to draw your attention to the figures on the slide. So on the left-hand side, you have what we call tightly coupled design, where you see that APIs are all designed for a specific application. And so every time there is this duplication of effort or and complexity that is generated by the fact that each time the API is considered in its own self without considering the different components that can be reused, and as a result, complexity grows over time, and you have issues with scalability, reliability, and more importantly, security of your different systems and APIs. On the right-hand side, however, now you see what happens when you design loosely coupled services, and this can be achieved through an API platform, which ensures the standardization, a better governance, and the reusability of all your different API assets and services. And at the same time, you can very well monitor the security as everything is in one place. Finally, there's the question of standards. So we've seen that APIs are great for interoperability and reuse of digital components, but then this in turn requires developing them according to certain standards. Here, well, I just want to highlight why it's important to develop your APIs according to certain standards. First of all, it allows you to avoid vendor lock-in. It also allows a streamlined and interoperable development, and it also allows this, which is very important because it means that they're easier to port from one platform to another because their technical implementation follows a standardized rule rather than one that is defined by the platform on which it is hosted. And so tools, frameworks, and guidelines are available via both industry or government initiatives. On the slide, there are just a couple that are mentioned. So Swagger.io provides a lot of open specifications, as well as the Open API initiative. There are also best practices in government, such as in the UK and Denmark, and I've added references to this material at the end of the presentation as well. Okay, so now, to finish off, I'd just like to mention a few key considerations for organizations that are acting as an API consumer. Again, there are certain legal considerations related to licensing, data protection, and the Internet of Things. And there are also a few technical considerations related to big data and artificial intelligence, as well as discoverability of services. And this can be done through multi-agent systems, and I'll just mention that in a minute. So in terms of legal considerations, there's a question of licensing. So as an API consumer, you must be aware of all the service license agreements and licensing conditions that are associated with the API that are being integrated into your processes. Because, for example, there's a risk that an API provider can change their pricing or turn off an API. And so for that reason, well, that can lead to a lot of issues when you're consuming their APIs. In terms of data protection, as a consumer, if you use personal data from a third party, you need to keep track of how you use this data and whether you can store it or not, where you can store it, in case you're requested to remove some data related to a specific person. For this, just referring back to the rights of the data subjects in the context of the GDPR. So you have to be able to delete this information even though you're getting it from a third party. And those 2 points are even more relevant when you're looking at data that is collected by sensors or provided via connected devices. Something that is very important and useful as a consumer is different functions and algorithms that you can use to embed into your processes and services that are related to machine learning and artificial intelligence. So here I'm just mentioning a few of them. This is of course not a comprehensive list either, but big industry players such as Google, IBM, and a lot of other startups are even taking a bigger role in this context, are providing machine learning, image processing, text analysis services via APIs. And this is very, very useful if you don't have the resources or the capabilities in-house to develop this. You can really easily use them to work on your own data and to offer services based on those algorithms. And then finally, I just want to mention the use of multi-agent systems for consuming APIs, which allow for the discoverability and the combination mostly. It's also very important, the integration of different services into a single application. And so here, just wanted to mention also a few different examples. So there's this JADE framework that is a multi-agent system that is used by anyone, basically, to support research activities and building applications by ensuring the discoverability of different services. There's also, for example, these little pieces of software that allow APIs from different public transport operations to be used and combined into a single interface. Voilà, so as a conclusion, I just wanted to express a few key takeaway messages. APIs and API ecosystems can play a central role in digital government transformation. Publishing and consuming APIs as an organization results in significant advantages in terms of the delivery of better services to citizen and business, to supporting interoperability and reuse of components, IT component services, or any data, digital information, and complying with legislation and regulatory guidelines. However, as we've seen from this presentation, there are a number of issues that need to be considered when you're implementing these APIs, either from a legal or an organizational point of view, as well as from a technical and semantic point of view. So for those of you who are interested in taking this topic further, here are a number of open questions that we wanted to ask. You can feel free to react to these in the chat or contact the project team at any moment if you would like to discuss these. So the questions are, what are specific challenges faced by public authorities for taking part in the API ecosystem? What are some use cases or existing examples that you find particularly valuable? And whether there are some issues that we have not touched upon today that you would like to be raised or addressed at any moment. So thank you, and I give the floor back to Robin for the next steps.
Well, merci. Thank you very much, Raphael, for taking us through what is, I think, a really important tour of the API landscape that particularly geospatial people need to know. Within, let's say, the policy context, on purpose, we didn't mention Inspire, which of course also has all the web services of the OGC. So we're already, let's say, as a geospatial community in Europe, active in this area. But what's really useful working in the ISA² context is that we can look wider and understand what colleagues are doing, let's say, more from the digital government, e-government context. So it's, of course, great to have you involved in this project and have your perspectives and understanding. And I also want to thank you not only for touching upon the technical aspects, which is highly relevant to many of our stakeholders, but also some of the legal ones. So I just also wanted to let everybody know that ELISE has just published an update of its location privacy guidelines to include some elements and issues around GDPR. And of course, that's just come at a time where Raphael and colleagues have done this work, and some of the issues around APIs are maybe going to need let's say, further work in this direction, because as GDPR is being implemented, and as we've demonstrated, cases of APIs as well, there's maybe some more consideration. So I really appreciate some of the highlights where GDPR was touching on technical issues, as Raphael presented at the end, because I think that helps to concretize some of the other examples given our newly published location privacy guidelines. The other 2 points I just wanted to pick up on for people to know is I also think the European Data Exchange Initiative is very interesting because it's also highlighting the topic of data spaces. It's not something, of course, we asked Raphael to present, but it was something that was mentioned in the slides. And I think that's relevant because it seems to be a topic that might be of interest in the future. We in the spatial data infrastructures world, at least, have been dealing with some aspects of this. But again, the opportunity working in this broader context and considering this broader landscape of APIs, it helps to ask questions about how geospatial fits into the exchange of data in data spaces and similar activities. Lastly, related work, we're performing this task with colleagues that relate to other activities in the B6 unit of the JRC on digital economy, where myself and Lorenzino Baccari, who's been supporting this particular study, we're doing some work with DG Connect on a project called APIs for DGov. And in that work, we've actually documented quite a lot to do with standards related to APIs. So it's great that Raphael has given the introduction today, but hopefully we'll have a report to share with you on that in the near future. So lastly, coming to the real next steps and to close with the nature of these rapid studies, as I said at the beginning, I don't give the colleagues very much time to dive into these. I'm fascinated about how quickly you can turn this around and to give us a real sense of some of the topics we should be concerned with here. And just to mention that we have already had a presentation about the general context of what's the potential role, shall we say, of geospatial in the digital transformation of government. And we have this presentation today, but shortly coming there will be the presentation from Danny from the K11 team on the role of persistent identifiers, and his colleague from K11, Therese, she's looking into topics to do with citizen science and let's say digital participation, as Raphael mentioned, and we hope to have that presentation towards the end of August, beginning of September. Danny's will be coming in July. So just to let you know, this is this open process that we're trying to run. We're sharing our evidence through these webinars, and we invite you, particularly for our working group members of the Geospatial Working Group in the ISA² program and their colleagues, but everybody is open to propose to us at least other topics, and for that reason we've created this dedicated page where you're able to get the slides and recordings of this activity, but also get in touch with us if you think there's some follow-up activities we could be doing. So looking at the time, I know we raised some questions at the end here, and there's a few people maybe have put comments in the chat, but I think it's best to close here the recording. And again, thank you very much, Raphael, and look forward to some follow-ups in the near future. Thanks to everyone.